So good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Finer, and I'm standing in for Margaret, Margaret Hughes, who's the new CEO of IPWSO, who unfortunately at the last minute was unable to be here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce, not that he needs introducing, Professor Tony Holland, who, as I'm sure everybody knows, has been a stalwart of the Prader-Willi syndrome community. Tony has spent most of his academic career researching into learning disabilities and founded pardon me, the Cambridge Intellectual and Development Disabilities Research Group that has produced so much rich understanding of some of the issues that people with Prader-Willi syndrome face. He is president of the International PWS Syndrome Association for a little bit longer, and he's going to talk about Prader-Willi syndrome around the world. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much for coming after what was a wonderful evening and a magnificent drone show last night. This is almost my last activity before I give up being president of the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organisation. And I want to just start this talk by saying what an enormous pleasure it has been being a president. I've been for 9 years. Normally it's only 6 years, but with COVID, they asked me to stay on a bit longer. And I think it is the most amazing organization. And the thing that I have perhaps learnt most from it is that we can learn so much from each other. And perhaps in countries like the UK, where I'm from, and maybe here in America, there is a danger that we assume that people just learn from us. But the experience is that we learn from people, particularly learn from people who are living in extraordinarily tough circumstances, in countries where there are no services, and the resilience that you see in the families to make certain that they support their son or daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome is absolutely wonderful and is a lesson for us all. So it's been a very special experience, and I'm very sorry to not to continue, but it'll be in the very safe hands of Nick here. So what I'm going to do is really, first of all, I just want to start by saying something which will be so obvious to you, but you'll see the point of it. Just say something about the complexity and rarity of Prader-Willi syndrome and the diagnostic challenges. Because if you think about how people support people with Prader-Willi syndrome around the world, it starts with the fact that someone has to say to themselves, I think this baby may have Prader-Willi syndrome. And then they have to be able to organize a genetic test. And that's a big problem in many parts of the world, as you will hear. So there is something about the rarity and complexity of the syndrome that creates real challenges across the world. The other point, and it's probably a theme that runs through the whole of this talk, and that is the importance of the Prader-Willi syndrome global community. What we've had over the last few days is incredibly important to families, to professionals, to care providers, all of us who work in this space. And that issue comes out time and time again when you go and visit countries, you take part in workshops, or you attend conferences like this. Then I want to say something about the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organisation, then tell some stories from around the world. And then I want to move into a slightly different area and look at the importance of rare disease policy, and particularly the central importance of the World Health Organization. People generally don't think of the World Health Organization as anything to do with rare disorders, but there's been a major initiative which I think is going to be very important for sons and daughters with Prader-Willi syndrome. And then look a bit at what FPWR does and PWSA USA as a way of paying homage to our hosts here in America. And then you'll see there's a special recording of a song called Me Too, which I'll play to end this session. So the point to make that really creates a major global challenge is the rarity of this lifelong, what's often referred to as neurodevelopmental, so it affects brain development, neurodevelopmental condition. But we know it affects all ethnic groups and genders, We know, and you can speak to this very strongly, I'm sure, the importance of early diagnosis. I mean, if you ask what's the 3 most important things, certainly early in life, it's early diagnosis, it's having knowledge about the syndrome, and it's having treatments that are available. In this case, it's growth hormone, and also support for families. Now, the global population of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, so the numbers of people with Prader-Willi syndrome in different countries in the world per head of population will vary enormously, and it varies because of differences in mortality rate. And that's because maybe the diagnosis is not made, the child becomes very obese, and there are problems that follow from that. We believe in some countries in the world there may be an increased mortality very early in life because of the failure to thrive. So there are a number of factors that actually influence the numbers of people, even though the birth incidence, so the numbers of children born per 1,000 of the population, is likely to be very, very similar. The other issue that I think is important in reflecting on differences across the world is that you, and in the UK too, we sort of take for granted both the need for a multidisciplinary approach and the availability of a multidisciplinary approach. Now, it may be at times chaotic and you have to turn up at different clinics on different days and so on and so forth. But we accept that we need, and it is accepted that we need dietetic support, you need genetic advice, you need good endocrinology, you need physiotherapy, all these sorts of things. These are accepted. And in many cases, they will be provided. As I say, it may be chaotic. But in many parts of the world, those expertise may not be available. So it'll be one person under very difficult conditions trying to support the child and you to care for the baby with Prader-Willi syndrome and as they grow up. The other factor, of course, that again you'll be very familiar is there's so much evidence out here that having a child with Prader-Willi syndrome is a big challenge. They're very loving children, but the behavior, the having to change your lifestyle because of the hyperphagia really puts an enormous stress on the family. So what are some of the global challenges? Well, I think they're mainly initially around late or missed diagnosis. And in many low and middle income countries, there may be limited or no access to genetic testing. And IPWSO provides a free genetic testing service, which I may touch on a bit later if there's time. There is probably very limited expert health or social care availability, unlikely to be growth hormone, so there may be no growth hormone available, or it may be available but not affordable, or it may be available, possibly affordable, but clinicians don't think about it. There's a whole number of reasons why people don't get growth hormone. People won't have access necessarily to the internet or to research findings that may help inform the way you support and care for your son or daughter. Education and training for professionals and caregivers is likely to be absent, although now through IPWSO, through what's known as our ECHO program, we've tried to improve on that. Advocacy and awareness about the needs of people with Prader-Willi syndrome will almost certainly be absent, and some of the stories that I'll tell you later shows how individuals, how parents have tried to rectify that in their country. And I think what's also very important, it's trusted information. The PWSA USA, PWSA UK, IPWSO, these organizations, they are built on a scientific, recognizing the importance of good science and recognizing the importance that advice and information that is given is based on good science. If you don't have such an organization you can turn to, the danger is that you do search the internet and you find bizarre stories or whatever. So I think one of the strengths, and I think this has been shown in this last week, is bringing together the families and professionals who really understand the basis and the cause of Prader-Willi syndrome. But in most countries in the world, that's not available. And there is one story that I'll be touching on about stigma. Stigma can be quite a significant problem, and the story is from a country in Africa, a stigma. But the point about it, we should be very careful not to assume that's not going to happen in our own country, even though we think of ourselves as advanced in our thinking. If I think of the history in the UK, there was appalling stigma for people with disabilities in the past. And things can change and things can go back. You need to always fight for respect for your son or daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome, or for any child in a minority setting who has a particular genetic syndrome, maybe Down syndrome or whatever it is. There are major financial constraints, and often we've come across countries where there may be some services in urban settings, but virtually nothing in rural settings. So what about global health inequalities in Prader-Willi syndrome? Well, we've heard of stories of delays, sometimes people not being diagnosed until they're in their 30s. But a significant proportion of people, the diagnosis is delayed over many years. And that's problematic because the families are struggling to make sense of their child's disability, and initially, of course, why it won't eat. But then, of course, the overeating emerges and they don't understand what's going on. But at one level, have a certain relief that that eating is now at least happening. So there may be serious problems with failure to thrive in the neonatal period. Life-threatening obesity may develop in childhood. And these are all things that certainly in the UK, when I first started working with people with Prader-Willi syndrome, were true in the UK because diagnoses weren't being made and people weren't informed. Serious physical illnesses develop with reduced life expectancy and poor quality of life. And there are missed opportunities for good best practice because diagnoses are made late, people don't have the information, and so on. And of course, there are major resource gaps in health, education, and social care. Now, I'm going to play, during the course of this, a few clips of things, but sometimes the sound isn't too good because they were recorded in a conference setting, but I hope that you'll be able to hear this. And IPWSO has recently had really quite a much greater involvement in Africa. It was an area where really we had no involvement at all, except in South Africa and some North African countries.
The case I presented, for instance, was referred at 2.5 months with poor feeding and weakness, and also persistent hypotonia. So initially, we thought this patient had neonatal sepsis, but all investigation proved negative. Urine RE, urine culture, blood culture, blood smear for malaria, complete blood counts, all came out to be negative. But we still treated for neonatal sepsis because the weakness, poor feeding are also signs of neonatal sepsis at times. And in neonates at times, they may not mount fever. But in this patient, the persistent hypotonia led to suspicion of Prader-Willi syndrome. We discharged the mother and we were looking around to see if we could get place for genetic diagnosis so that we'll be able to confirm and manage. Unfortunately, the patient died before we could
move on at this. But just to say that the lesson there, I think, is an interesting one. And what he was saying is the initial thought was that this very floppy baby had sepsis. And the point is that diagnosis is made within the context of the environment where the child is at the time. And sepsis, as well as other serious infectious diseases, may be much more common in Ghana than they would be here in America or in the UK. And as a medical student, one of the first things you're taught is the obvious, that common things occur commonly. So when you see a baby that's floppy and sepsis or some other illness is common, that's what you think of. And if no one has said to you, no, there is a rare disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome, which floppiness is key, you don't think of it. There's no reason for you to think of it. So this just shows, this is not a criticism of the pediatricians, it just shows that you work within a particular medical context and that you should, rightfully so, think about common things, but you need also to think about rare things. But it illustrates the challenge of diagnosis.
Effectivement, l'année dernière, j'ai bénéficié d'un travel grant de la part de IPWSO qui m'a permis de participer à la conférence ASPEC en Algérie Et pendant cette conférence, j'ai eu l'occasion d'apprendre davantage sur le syndrome de Prader-Willi et aussi de voir des enfants qui étaient atteints de la maladie et d'échanger avec quelques familles pour voir un peu quelles sont leurs difficultés, étant donné que dans mon pays, c'est une maladie qui n'est pas bien connue, en dehors des pédiatres, les autres spécialistes qui prennent en charge l'enfant ne connaissent pas bien la pathologie. Et ça m'a permis aussi de penser à une idée de formation pour pouvoir améliorer le diagnostic dans mon pays, parce que si les gens sont capables d'identifier les enfants, ils pourraient nous les envoyer pour qu'on puisse confirmer les diagnostics et aussi leur offrir une meilleure qualité de vie par une prise en charge adaptée avec les moyens disponibles.
So I think what that illustrates is with a relatively simple intervention, very low cost, in other words, attending in this case an endocrinological conference, the doctors become informed, they hear about it, and therefore they think about it. That's all we're asking of people to do, is to think about it when there's a floppy baby of unknown cause. And IPSO, as I say, offers free genetic testing, so if that's not available in the country or it's unaffordable, they can send a blood spot to us, and it goes to a lab in Italy, and the genetics can be tested. So it's a very simple intervention at very low cost, can transform things in a country. Now, we also were interested as an organization to think about some of the resource gaps that are there. And one example of that is that in Brazil, there's a very active association in Brazil, a very impressive association. They've estimated that they think there should be at least 3,000 people with Prader-Willi syndrome there, but only about a third of that are known. And one of the real challenges for Brazil is you've got Rio and Sao Paulo, and you've got one or two other large cities, but you've got the whole Amazon region. And how do you provide a diagnostic service across a vast country, which has extraordinarily challenging geography? And again, we find this the whole time. We might be involved in a country, a small country or an island country, and then you've got a country like Brazil. The challenges are very different under those circumstances. And somehow you have to try and get information out there to the pediatricians and so on. And the other, I think, example of the unmet need is the advice line, the queries we get about what to do about this and what to do about that, because they have no one in their country to turn to. And I know some of those queries actually come through to PWSA USA because you're so well known, but we get a lot of them. And that just illustrates that there's no one in that country that people can turn to. And information about Prader-Willi syndrome may be very limited, and one of the key things that IPSO does is provide information in different languages. I think this is a nice tagline. Alone we are rare, together we are strong. And this is the National Association for Rare Disorders tagline. And I think that just the point to make here is that there is the challenge of Prader-Willi syndrome being a rare disorder, but there are estimated to be at least 7,000 rare disorders. So if you club together as a rare disorder group, you have power. You really do have power. But as a single syndrome, it can be a real challenge. So you look at a country such as South Africa, for example, and Romania is another example. Their whole advocacy for people with Prader-Willi syndrome is done through the National Rare Disease Organizations. So in a way, as we say, it's sort of horses for courses, that you look at what's available in your country and you look to how you use your advocacy to best effect, whether it's through having your own Prader-Willi association or whether it's through rare disease or some other means. Now, this is Margaret Hughes, who used to be a CEO of IPSO, and she just has a rather nice story here about what she calls finding your tribe. And that, in this case, is, if you like, us here. It's the Prader-Willi tribe.
Where I live in Ireland, the idea of finding one's tribe has become very popular in recent years. So this refers to the notion of finding a group where one fits in and where one is understood. And of course, it's premised on an understanding that one's local ecosystem or environment may not understand everyone and may not be supportive. There's a meme on Twitter that on Facebook and social media that many of you may have come across, which I think describes this idea very well, and it's called "A special needs parent fell in a hole." The family member says, "What hole?" One's boss says, "Oh, that's a shame, you can take the day off." The doctor says, "Can you keep a diary of your experiences in the hole?" The Department of something says, "We will assess the size of the hole, however, it may take up to 18 months. The local authority says, "Sorry, we don't have enough money for a ladder." A charity says, "Here's a form, fill it in to apply to get on the waiting list for a ladder." And another parent says, "I'm here, I'm coming down there with you, I've been here before, I know how to get out and I won't let you do it alone." I think this desire to find others who understand that the position that we're in is a particularly strong motivator for the formation and the continuity of rare disease groups like PWS associations.
Isn't that a wonderful example, I think? And this is just an illustration, some quotes. For many years, I longed to meet another family with a child who has Prader-Willi syndrome. The first time I shared the founders of Prader-Willi Syndrome Association Costa Rica, it was a truly wonderful experience. I felt I was understood and found sisters who supported me on this journey. And I fell in love with all the specialists and all the knowledge that I was able to feed on in order to continue this arduous journey with my son. Infinitely grateful to the Colombian Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. We hear this sort of thing time and time again, that just having support from fellow parents, a parent who has been through what they are now going through, but also having knowledge and information so they understand the needs of their son and daughter who has Prader-Willi syndrome. It's also always important in these occasions to celebrate successes. And me as a psychiatrist and doctors are the worst people at telling horrible stories about crises and things that go wrong. We must remember that there really are some successes. And I think some of you may have heard Mr. Lin speak from Prader-Willi Syndrome Association China. Extraordinary things that he has been able to do. From nothing, he's really now established services that identify and diagnose people with Prader-Willi syndrome, provide support to them, and so on and so forth. It just shows what a person can do. In this case, perhaps slightly unusually, a man. In preparing this talk, I've come across a lot of tough women, not so many tough men, I have to say, which I'm sorry to hear about, but that's the way it is. Prader-Willi Syndrome Ireland, and I've been very involved with the services there, have developed after some years of argument with the government, a respite house there, and that's transformed things for the families in Ireland. And then there's all the work that PWSA do and FPWR have done, and the fact that we've now got the first drug to treat hyperphagia approved. These are examples of how working together as parents, as clinicians, as researchers, as advocates, one can actually make a difference. But the needs can be very different across the world. Now, the person in the picture there is Jean Phillips Martinson, and that's her son, Anders, who sadly died a few years ago. Excuse me. Jean Phillips Martinson, it's okay, I think I've recovered. Jean Phillips Martinson was really the founder of the International PWS Syndrome Organisation. She's from the UK, but she was married to a Swede and lived many years of her life in Sweden. And I just want to now reflect on some of the work that IPSO has done. And Jean is still alive, and she's still very interested in what we do, and she's also very generously financially supports the work that we do. But the vision of IPSO is a world where people with Prader-Willi syndrome and their families receive the services and support they need to fulfill their potential and achieve their goals. And the mission is to unite the global Prader-Willi syndrome community to collectively find... Thank you very much. Thank you. Would that be safe up there? No. collectively find solutions to the challenges of the syndrome and to support and advocate for people with Prader-Willi syndrome and their families, Prader-Willi associations, and professionals who work with people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think Jean is the example of someone who made an enormous difference. You know, she realized that there were real gaps. She helped establish the Swedish Association, and then went on, and I'll talk a little more about this later, with Susie Cassidy to help establish IPWSO, which has been involved in both being an umbrella organization for other national associations, as well as providing support in countries where there are no associations. These are the countries in the world. So our membership, our national associations are not individuals. We have 47 paid members, and we have contacts in over 100 countries. But I put at the bottom there that there are 193 countries are members of the United Nations. So you can see there are many, many countries that we have no contact in. I mean, I can think of a country as big as Indonesia, for example. I don't think we have any contacts there. And then there are countries in the world like Ukraine. Well, there's a Ukrainian association, but countries in crisis, Myanmar perhaps is another example, Venezuela, and so on and so forth, in which there is probably nothing for people with Prader-Willi syndrome in those countries. Just to say, I've always rather liked this. The IPWSO was founded on the 4th of May, 1991. Well, it happens to be my birthday, the 4th of May. Not, I have to say, sadly, in 1991, a few years before that. As I say, Jean Phillips Martinson and Susie Cassidy really established it. And I list the places that this conference has taken place in. And you can see it's spread out generally across the world, as wide as far as New Zealand, for example, Taiwan, Canada, Cuba, and so on. And those have happened every 3 years. And I've actually been to every one of those conferences, and they've got more and more interesting. And of course, our understanding of the syndrome has changed dramatically over that time. So IPWSO provides support in a number of ways globally. Free diagnostic testing, I've mentioned, providing translated resources. There are an infinite number of languages, you sometimes feel, but we try and do our best there. Helplines and workshops, the international conference, which established sort of global clinical and professional networks, arrange information sharing, support national associations, and we try and support and make connections for emerging Prader-Willi syndrome, national Prader-Willi syndrome groups. And we're increasingly undertaking research that has a global perspective to it. You know, and we're not a research organization, and we wouldn't wish to enter the field of FPWR, for example. But there are questions that can be answered through research of a more global nature that I think are very informative. This was a very long quote from the founder and president of the Indian Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. I tried to shrink it down a little bit, but I think that just you look at it whilst I talk, you can see the message that comes out of that. You know, it's essentially about struggling to understand why your child is struggling itself, and then finding an answer through receiving a diagnosis which hadn't been possible before. And these are examples of some of the things that have been translated. And one of the things that has turned out to be very important is a very simple guide in terms of what helps people diagnose Prader-Willi syndrome. You know, on a single sheet of paper, this is what Prader-Willi syndrome is like in infancy. And of course, for many countries, the diagnosis hasn't been made in infancy. So you also have to help people revisit the question of diagnosis in later life. And when I first became interested in Prader-Willi syndrome, I remember seeing a family that came to see me and said, their daughter, who was in her late 20s, I think our daughter has Prader-Willi syndrome. They'd heard me talk on the radio about it. And of course, they were absolutely right. And what had happened is that she hadn't been diagnosed at birth, because at the time the genetic tests were fairly new and so on. And therefore, no one revisited. No one at any point, until they heard the story on the radio, no one at any point said, maybe we should ask, can we now make a diagnosis and help the family and the person themselves understand why they struggle with the way they do. One of the key things that I think we do is build connections, and we do that by attending various events across the world. I can't always remember what all these acronyms stand for, but most of them are pediatric endocrine organizations in different continents and different countries. But you can see, I think there's Charlotte there on the far right, in the Kenyan Pediatric Society. And if you can just get a foothold in there, it can make an enormous difference. The other thing, I think, is we as an organization, from a sort of global perspective, have to be aware of how technologies are advancing. And there may be things that can be done that can make life easier. I mean, perhaps the best example here is the use of technology to train people, to inform people. But there are a number of ways that technology may be helpful. We've had seminar on postnatal screening for Prader-Willi syndrome, work on mobile health technologies, how one might do cross-country mentoring for professionals and for families. Development, we've had the IPWSO Mental Health Network, because there are very few psychiatrists and psychologists across the world that really understand Prader-Willi syndrome. We've tried to look at how we can use digital technology to help people, and in African countries, the mobile phone is actually very, very important, so everything must be accessible via your mobile phone. We've had what's called the ECHO program, which was initially developed here at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and it's a tele-mentoring program, and we've used that way of trying to engage people in different countries in the world. And I put here supporting advocacy, in brackets, providing evidence. It's very important. People in different countries have come to us and said, we hear that growth hormone is good for our children, but we can't get our government to provide it. And what we do is we say, here's the evidence. And it's, we've quoted the papers and all that sort of thing. Go to your government now with that evidence and say to your government, look, all these countries here provide growth hormone. Why aren't you providing growth hormone? And when I come to discuss the World Health Organization, it's that sort of way of making your case that I think is very important. There are barriers to overcome, and this is the example. It says at the bottom, unfortunately, we lost sight of her, that's the person with Prader-Willi syndrome, because of a kind of pathology. This kind of pathology is considered spiritual in our country. It's very stigmatizing, and parents always say to themselves that it's not normal. They try to find out who might be responsible. And when you go down that road, in the end, you don't come back to the hospital, you go back to the village. And I think that's a very, very powerful statement. And as I said right at the beginning, we just have to be careful to think that won't happen to us. These things can just arise for no reason. You can get prejudices, against minority groups and so on. And people with Prader-Willi syndrome, people with developmental disabilities are a minority group. And we just need to be, you as an organization in your country and all our countries, we just need to be very firm. People with Prader-Willi syndrome have human rights like all of us, and we must never allow those to be taken away. So one of the things we're working towards is how can we improve equity or equality across the world. One of the things I think is be respectful of local circumstances. So we often say it's about locally adapting international best practice. And one of the challenges for us is when we write best practice documents about, growth hormone, for example. Well, here you might get a sleep study before you start growth hormone. But in many countries, that would be unaffordable or impossible. So what do you do about that? So there are these discussions to be had. We very much argue for national rare disease strategies. We do virtual training and telehealth platforms. We help develop parent and professional networks across countries, as well as global clinical and professional networks. So the role of IPWSO is, we call it democratizing access to knowledge and care, championing early diagnosis and intervention, and collaborating on research and advocacy. And we have enormous support from the USA Friends of IPWSO that Michelle Torbert is the chair of the Friends. Joan Gardner was one of the key people in starting Friends. And it's a separate charity so that Americans who give to it get the tax breaks, but they then help to fund work that we do. And IPSO as an organisation is registered as a charity in the UK. So to support meetings in different countries in the world, so Malaysia, India, Mexico. And it's really valuable. And sometimes the amount of money is relatively modest. And it's remarkable what you can do with it. Now I want to tell just a few quick stories from around the world, just to illustrate some of the challenges, as well as some of, I think, successes. So I was at a rare disease conference in Abu Dhabi recently, and Farah Al-Madoun came up to talk to me, and we had a poster about Prader-Willi syndrome there and the work of IPSO. And she's a genetic counsellor based in Jordan, but she happens to be a counsellor that really helps counsel Arab families from much of the Arabic-speaking world, so across North Africa and the Middle East. And she was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And she was really interested in it. And she went away, and the next thing we knew is she had made a video about Prader-Willi syndrome and sent it out through her social media channels. I mean, this was just a few months ago, and since then 5 people have been diagnosed as having Prader-Willi syndrome in that area. Now, that may be small, but isn't it amazing? And we've got a very strong, a very developing and potentially very strong organization in Egypt. She's linking in now, I think, to that organization. Suzanne Blichfeld, who I'll show you, who's a pediatrician who works with IPSO, is arranging to do a virtual seminar and so on and so forth. And 2 of us have been invited to the endocrinology conference, the Middle East Endocrinology Conference, in a few months' time in Dubai. All of this because she came up to me and looked at the poster and talked about it, and I was able to say, email so-and-so at IPSO. And then it snowballed from there, but she took the initiative in doing that. Here is Soha and her mother, Sabika. Now, she's originally of families from Pakistan. They moved to Canada and lived in Canada for a while, where their daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome was born, and the diagnosis was made very quickly. They then moved to Qatar, so it's Canada at the bottom there, you might tell, and not Qatar, and then Qatar at the top. And she realized there that really there were not services, and there really was no attention being paid to conditions such as Prader-Willi syndrome. And although she works full-time, she's campaigning at Qatar to improve things. Qatar is going to host, I think it's in 2028, the World Disability Forum. And then the next thing is she said, I'm going to do a PhD about disability so I can study how people with disability are supported in this Middle Eastern country. And she's registered with a distant PhD at the University of Cambridge and is supported there. And I meet with her, I'm not supervising in any way, but meet with her when she comes. She comes for a week, twice a year. I mean, what extraordinary energy. I mean, a PhD is not easy. I mean, it's part-time, but it's not easy. A full-time job, campaigning, caring for her daughter. It's just amazing, really, really is. And then Eastern Europe. I mean, I think Nicolinka's here. I think there you are. And I'm sorry, it was a bit too late to put in some of the photographs, but thank you for sending them. But I mean, we've had meetings in Bulgaria, and it's amazing, Nicolinka, what you are doing there. So you run a clinic in Varna, which I think is on the Black Sea coast in Bulgaria. But again, I particularly use you as an example next to the person we were talking about before, because you became interested and then you went on to do a PhD. And whilst you're not a mother of a child with Prader-Willi syndrome, you are now hooked into the Prader-Willi syndrome world because of the people you see and because of the studies that you've made. And linking with Monica here, who chairs the Bulgarian Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. And a number of us went out there some time ago and were interviewed there, and we appear on Bulgarian radio, not appear, we can be heard on Bulgarian radio. Now, can you imagine how that transforms things for people with Prader-Willi syndrome in that country? The person that I admire enormously is Dorica Dan. Now, Dorica is a very good example. Her child with Prader-Willi syndrome wasn't diagnosed until quite late in life. In fact, her child was the first person to have the genetic diagnosis made by the Bird Institute in Italy, which is where IPSO sends the samples. And it's amazing. But what's amazing about her, and I can't easily, I can't read it there, but you can see here, she has done all those things. I mean, she is a force. I mean, you feel it when you're in her presence, what she's succeeded to do. And she's placed Prader-Willi syndrome within the rare disease space in Romania. And I think that makes a lot of sense, you know. Now, in South Africa, we have, I'm sorry, Karen Clark's name is hidden, I think, behind the photograph, but Karen Clark founded the South African Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, which is now actually, again, merged more with the Rare Disease Organisation in South Africa. But this is below Molalenkeng is the third person here who's done a PhD. She's a psychologist, and she's done a PhD about the needs of people with Prader-Willi syndrome in South Africa. And she's very much engaged in supporting people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I emailed her and said, can I have some people would be happy to have their photographs shown at this meeting. And the 4 people she spoke to all said, you must show my photograph. So I promised I would cram the photographs on, and I'm not very good at doing these things, but all 4 are there. So I just want to really illustrate how people approach this issue. They get, something pulls them into the Prader-Willi syndrome world, and then, you know, if they really engage with it, if they're professional, they may go on to do their own research and their own studies, and then they're committed in the long term. These are Latin America. I mean, again, I think enormous. I'm incredibly impressed by the work, you know, well, it's always difficult naming countries because you don't always name the countries that you should because you forget standing up here. But there are, you know, certainly Brazil, Chile, Argentina, enormous amount that they're doing there. On the Argentina one, that's what's called SPINE, an organization that supports people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, started by, I think, Ocarina Stegman and others. Extraordinary work they do in financially very challenging times. I mean, inflation is very high. So Cuba, we had our the conference before last in Cuba, again, under extraordinarily different circumstances because of the sanctions and so on and so forth. And Brazil, I've been to Brazil, and such enthusiasm there to try and improve things for people with the syndrome. And Latin America established a sort of network of organizations, and I think this probably hasn't quite taken off yet, but looking at ways that IPSO might help with that. And then the Asia-Pacific Rim. And there are more people. I mean, there are more people, for example, in Australia. I could have listed up there. But, I mean, you mentioned earlier Mr. Lin and China, extraordinary changes in China. The psychologists teaching at the Morning Star Center in Vietnam, teaching people who support people with Prader-Willi syndrome. In Australia, we have Georgina here, who has been with IPSO for so long and is wonderfully, has this multidisciplinary clinic in Sydney. We have David Godler, who's done the work on postnatal screening, and James O'Brien, who now again is chairman of the Australian Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. You know, these are examples of people who've really made a difference in their country. Now, I want to just focus on Denmark because I think Denmark is an example. It's a tiny country with a relatively small population. But it's a country, it's regularly rated among the top 3 as the happiest country in the world. It has a very strong social network and social support system, you know, with benefits and so on. What's interesting about it is despite the money it gives to help support people with disabilities and things, it also is a very active member of NATO and of the EU. I found out when researching this for this talk that Denmark, along with Estonia, for their gross national product, have given more money to support Ukraine than any other country in the world. Isn't that amazing? So it's not that they use all their money to support Danish people. They also use their money to support people who are in crisis. And they've been very important in helping IPWSO and so on. It's where Novo Nordisk, the maker of Ozempic, is based. It's a Danish company. The Novo Nordisk Foundation supports research in that area. Susanne Blichfeld, these are her two sons at the bottom. The lad on the left is a son with Prader-Willi syndrome. Suzanne thinks that he was probably the first person with Prader-Willi syndrome to receive growth hormone. And at that time, the growth hormone was from cadavers, from human people who had died from taking out the pituitary, because they didn't have the technology to make it as they do now. And she fought for it, because as a pediatrician, she was convinced that he had growth hormone deficiency. And she said she phoned people elsewhere in Europe and in America, and they all said to her, "Don't do it, they don't need it." And she was determined. And then Scandinavia led in a lot of the early studies of growth hormone, as did this country, and the rest is history from that point of view. On the right are two examples of two people with Prader-Willi syndrome who live in Greenland. As you know, Greenland is supported as part of Denmark. It's sort of independent, but supported by Denmark. And they have free healthcare. One of them needed major surgery, spinal surgery. They were flown at the cost of the state of Dania to the mainland and had spinal surgery there. They have established a Prader-Willi syndrome group home there. I mean, it's so impressive. And then Mikkel, he now has moved to this house on an island, which I visited some time ago. He loves horse riding. The island is wonderful because it's contained. There are the odd shops there, but there isn't quite the temptation. And the quality of life is quite excellent. I just noticed the time here, so I'll move on. This is the Bird Institute where genetic testing is done. Now, I want to just end really with just some comments about the importance of international and national policies. Here you will see some of the changes, like drugs, the Orphan Drug Act and the importance of that, the European Council recommending action in the field of rare diseases, and then the 2019 WHO including rare diseases for the first time in the World Assembly. This may not matter so much for a country as big as America or for Europe, but it matters enormously for small countries, because they're able to turn to the WHO and turn to their own governments and say, the WHO is recommending this. It is a wonderful organization. It's a just amazing organization. I'm a real fan of it. We tend to think of it as being infectious diseases. It campaigns for people with rare disease, and that includes people with Prader-Willi syndrome. There are many non-governmental organizations like Eurordis, NORD, Rare Diseases International, then down on the bottom left, endocrine organizations, disability organizations, patient alliance organizations, and so on. All that are very important, campaigning for people, in this case, with Prader-Willi syndrome. So just a few comments. Just services for people with Prader-Willi syndrome vary dramatically across the world, but there's always need. International collaboration is essential, so we should think of a global Prader-Willi community. IPWSO serves as a sort of bridge. But this fundamentally has been a story of how individuals make a difference. Now, I'm almost at the end, but I just want to acknowledge our hosts here in the USA, FPWR and PWSA USA. The Foundation for Prader-Willi Research has been amazing in its support for research, and its research, good research, respect for science that has led to where we are now. Not some fancy, odd ideas. It's absolute, proper science that has brought about new treatments, and this is really, really important. Supported trials, commitment to people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and so on and so forth. And you can see Teresa Strong and Susan Hedstrom, who will be very familiar to you. So I acknowledge them. And then this is the 50th anniversary of the foundation of Prader-Willi Syndrome Association USA. And we had the party last night, and Stacey here. I mean, it's an amazing organization. It was the first national association, and I think it's been an enormous supporter of IPWSO over the years. It's a leader in advocacy, and it's an example for many organizations, all of us, throughout the world. I mentioned that late Pam Ison was a president of IPSO, and Susie Cassidy was the president of IPSO. Pam had a daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome. But then they also went, a group from here in America went on to establish Friends of IPSO. So I mentioned Michelle as chair and Joan Gardner as one of the founders. And we're enormously grateful to what they have to offer. And they're an example to all of us. I'm really impressed. Now, this, I want to just play this to end, and it's very moving for me. You can read this. Just to say the first bit, the sound will come, but it takes a little bit of time to come.
Hello, out there from me inside. I want you to hear when you look in my eyes. Help me to grow and help me to be part of this world. Are you ready for me? For me. Hello, you two, don't look so scared. You're frightened to see if I'll make it out there. But I don't want to hide, so let's go outside into the world with our heads held up high. 'Cause children are playing and I hear people saying, maybe this isn't for you. But I say, me too. Me too. Hello, I hear your words, your sighs. Feel so much love when I look in your eyes. I know that we're one. You're cheering me on. That's why I'm here and I'm singing this song. Hello, out there from me, right here. I'm living my life without pity or fear. Family bonds making me strong. Walking together, our love will go on and on. 'Cause children are playing and I hear people saying, maybe this isn't for you. But I say, me too. I say, me too. I say, me too. I say, me too. I say, me too.
Well, thank you, Tony, for that amazing talk and an amazing ending as well. We've got just about 5 minutes for some questions. I don't know if there are any roving mics, but perhaps I'm going to start off, I think, by just asking you, Tony, if you were benchmarking the Prader-Willi syndrome, if you like, organization family, compared to other rare diseases, How do you think we're doing?
Actually, I think we're doing really well. I mean, I don't what people feel out there, but I mean, I think what we've got is we've got a number of very strong national associations. Then we've got FPWR, who's really transformed the research scene. And then I think IPSO is a sort of overarching thing. And there's very few other rare disease conditions which have that mix in them. So I think, I mean, I do fear that I think it's fragile. Because it often depends upon a few people, depends on getting the money to support the various organizations, and that's not guaranteed.
Are there any other points that anybody? Yes, there's a question there. Have we got a roving mic? I'll bring it to you. Here we are.
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth Oyenusi. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist from Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria. I'm the present president of the African Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Endocrinology. And I'm quite emotional because the simple things matter. Yeah. When a parent has a child who the doctors can't give diagnosis to, is very distressing for them. And as a doctor, as a pediatric endocrinologist, when you think only of the commonest conditions, and Prader-Willi doesn't come up. Yeah. So many children were undiagnosed until 2023. And it was just a simple webinar that IPSO just shared with us over a 1-hour Zoom meeting. And then we started thinking Prader-Willi syndrome. And also because there was a simple genetic testing you could do, simple sample you could put on your filter paper. It has made a lot of difference from 0 cases in sub-Saharan Africa to at least 5 now. And now we're driving the advocacy, and very soon, even as we're taking baby steps, we're going to progress. Thank you so much to IPSO.
I thank you for that, and it's a very nice example of what we can do is sow the seed, and it's clearly taken and growing, and that's just wonderful.
Any more, so I can get some more exercise? Okay. So, Tony, thank you very much. I mean, I think, you've really covered the importance of going beyond national, going beyond your own family, going beyond your own very local community, how important that is, really. And I thank you for that. And with that, we'll close this session. Thank you all for coming.